Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our conference, the Philippines, Spain, and Globalization, 16th century to the present. We're now in session 8. And here in this meeting, we are pleased to have panel 8A, titled Knowledge Making and Labor in the Spanish Philippines. It is composed of four presenters, although there appears to be a slight change in the order of presentation. And so please correct your conference programs. We will have as our first presenter, rather than the last, Kerby Alvarez of UP Diliman, who will present his paper, Meteorologists, Weather Observers, Engineers, and Cartographers, Meteorological and Seismological Knowledge Production in the Philippines, 1860s to the 1890s. And then to follow him would be Ruel Pagunsan of UB Diliman, with the paper titled Juan de Cuellar and the Production of Philippine Natural History, 1786 to 1794. Third presenter is Anthony David Medrano of Yale-NUS College with the paper Fiera del Pais, Castro de Elera, and the Rise of Philippine Zoology, 1875 to 1897. And the last presenter is Jely Galang of UP Diliman, addressing the Chinese question, Rafael de Comenge, and the study of the Chinese in the late 19th century Philippines. So the presenters will be uh, presenting one after the other, with no further introductions.
So, good afternoon to everyone. So, allow me to read my paper. The title is Meteorologists, Weather Observers, Seismologists, Engineers, and Cartographers, Meteorological and Seismological Knowledge Production in the Philippines, 1860s to the 1890s. Wait, I just show my PowerPoint. Okay. So, in the 19th century, the Philippine archipelago was at the crossroads. On the one hand, it was a colony with the government always facing perennial fiscal imbalance, a territory under strong influence of various religious orders, and an archipelago hampered by frequent environmental calamities. And on the other hand, it was a site of burgeoning scientific advancements pertaining to the physical environment, instrumentation, and institutionalization of scientific disciplines, and the influx of foreign knowledge for the benefit of the colonial economy. What's the describes this
Kirby,
period as an hello?
sorry to interrupt. Will you be using a PowerPoint?
Yes, I'm using a PowerPoint. Yes.
We can't see it right now.
Okay.
Please
Share screen. Okay.
share screen. Yes, you can find it at the bottom.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
There you go. And
Okay.
then
So
hit the slideshow. But yes, thank you very
okay.
much.
Okay. So West Delems argued describes this period as an era of massive urbanization, landscape change, and population growth, and there was a rise of complex socio-economic movements that made areas, such as the capital city of Manila, experience major urban transformations. The scientific developments in one way was realized through the emergence of institutions. In History of Science, the vectors of assemblage framework explains that the local scientific infrastructure only is made up not only by the physical components such as laboratories and instruments, but also of ideas and strategies, theories and taxonomies, communities of trained personnel, and socio-professional experts. Subsequent to the establishment of institutions is the transformation of scientific initiatives from mere laboratory work to a form of government service. Scientific personnel were subjected to the rudiments of administrative protocols, from research funding, daily office operations, to salaries of staff. Thus, bureaucratization turned research and scientific endeavors to government work. Scientific and administrative service is then equated to knowledge production. The rise of colonial institutions specifically mandated to pursue research and public service grounded on science ushered in the production of new knowledge, particularly on the workings of the natural environment. This paper presents a historical study of the scientific work of the personnel of the Observatorio Meteorologico de Manila, Inspección General de Minas, and the Inspección General de Obras Públicas. The study argues that their work and published studies were pioneer in meteorological and seismological knowledge production And this works invites us to re-examine the various policies on the economy and the environment in the 19th century. The beginnings of meteorology in the archipelago can be traced back to the experiments conducted by several Jesuits of the Ateneo Municipal de Manila in 1865. This initiative caught the attention of Manila merchants, and they immediately saw the value of meteorological studies for their businesses. In 1884, through the arduous support of then Governor General Fernando Primo de Rivera, the King of Spain issued a royal decree declaring the observatory as the official meteorological service in the Philippines and directed the insular government to place the observatory under direct government supervision. The official seal of the observatory showed two improvised instruments, a vertical mercurial barometer and a thermometer. It also depicts the circulation of wind when tropical hurricanes or typhoons emerge. This pictorial symbolism of instruments as identification of the observatory can also be seen in the 1915 seal of the Philippine Weather Bureau, wherein a modern circular shaped aneroid barometer was used. The newly established State Meteorological Agency remained under the supervision of the Jesuits. The government assigned them the positions of director and assistant directors. From its establishment in 1865 until the start of the Pacific War in 1941, three Jesuits served as the head of the observatory. Federico Faura from 1865 until his death in 1897, Jose Algue from 1897 until his resignation due to a health concern in 1927, and Miguel Selga from 1927 until the start of the Japanese occupation of Manila in 1941. The procedural and methodical work uh, required the observatory to hire personnel who were capable of doing tasks which involved numerical and mechanical observations, computations, and assessments. To fulfill their new mandate, the observatory hired personnel to fill up the following positions: observadores, calculistas, mecánicos, delineantes, alumnos, and ordenanzas. It can be inferred that in the context of work and employment, the teaching of science was also done. The Jesuit fathers served as scientist teachers, and the rigorous and tedious work in the observatory became a platform to train personnel beyond fulfilling the routine tasks. To mention some, Toribio Jovellanos and Cesareo de Lueño were notable through their work diligence. Jovellanos was part of Father
Hi,
Faure's team.
Kirby.
Yes.
You seem to have some static in your audio. Uh, is there some issue with the microphone?
Sorry.
There
Hello,
seems to be
hello.
static. Hello, Kirby.
Hello.
There seems to be some static. Is there a problem with your audio, with your microphone?
I don't hear. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
Do you
but
hear me?
yes, but it's uh the audio is garbled. It's distorted.
Okay. It's now clear?
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, so, okay, okay. Uh, Jovellanos was part of Father Faura's team that facilitated the establishment of secondary stations from 1884 until 1887. Doloeña was a member of the first expeditions in Mindanao aimed to conduct terrestrial magnetism surveys. Both of them served in the observatory from its early years until the second half of the American regime in the Philippines. The picture you see right now is a special painting in celebration of the golden anniversary of the observatory in 1950. The 1884 royal decree also indicated individual salaries of the native personnel with yearly amounts ranging from 96 pesos to 900 pesos. Okay? Both central station and secondary station workers. If we're going to compare these salaries with those of local professional employees and workers during the 1890s, we will notice that the staff of the observatory received a relatively high income compared to the former. As a comparison, in the study of Richardson, Katipunan members who were considered part of the lower and middle class, government employees, clerks, agents, tobacco factory workers, and printing press workers, received 180 to 300 pesos per year. We can infer that the scientific staff of the observatory falls to these socio-economic categories. The picture you see is a 1893 presupuesto or government budget report indicating the salaries, monthly salaries of some of the personnel of the Manila Observatory. The number of functioning weather stations of the observatory outside Manila increased from 1884 to 1887. The network of stations of the observatory had one central station in Manila and 13 secondary stations, all in the island of Luzon, locating in the areas you see in the screen. Okay, so from the northern part of Luzon until the Bicol Peninsula. So 13 stations gathering weather data, and they send it every day to the central station. Designated to these stations were those required to have skills in using various instruments and the telegraph. For they needed to submit reports to Manila on a regular basis. The infrastructural investments and development made the observatory the leading institution in weather data collection in the Pacific. Although it is arguably given the correspondingly fast development of the meteorological activities in the Philippines with the Jesuits, we can also comment how other countries how other countries did in their respective territories, such as in China and Japan. By year 1915, the number of secondary stations grew to 52, including specialized rain stations all around the archipelago. In its formative years, the observatory published weather bulletins and typhoon warnings in several newspapers, such as the Diario de Manila. Weather bulletins include the following information: temperature, atmospheric pressure, wind speed and direction, cloud formation, and general weather forecasts. They also included the meteorological data they gathered in the laboratory and published them as books. Okay? To name a few, Bagios y Collias, Boletín del Observatorio de Manila, and the Boletín Observaciones Meteorológicas. The research initiatives and published outputs of the observatory starting from the 1860s until the end of the 19th century reflects a double-edged approach of harnessing information from the Philippine local environment and the broader Pacific region. Anduaga argues that in 1880, 15 years since its establishment, the observatory has typhoon forecasting as its principal task. From 1880 to 1914, the observatory published 70 research works, 15 during the last years of the Spanish era, and to mention 55 during the first 15 years of American rule. For more than 5 decades, from the 1880s until the 1930s, the observatory made and published 25 notable works on the nature and history of typhoons in the Philippines. This aside from the thousands of volumes of meteorological data in the form of daily, monthly, and annual reports of the observatory. The observatory could be considered as the most productive center of cyclonic studies in Southeast Asia and in the Far East in the 19th century. Fathers Faura and Algue teamed up and produced several publications on typhoons, as you can see in the list shown to you. Faura's Señales Precursoras contains information about typhoons, recent studies, and precautionary measures in situations of typhoon landfall, one of the first compilations of research and observation notes about tropical typhoons in the Philippines. In 1904, an updated English version of the Bagyos o Ciclones Filipinos titled The Cyclones of the Far East was published under the auspices of the American civil government. So this is the English version of the Bagyos o Ciclones Filipinos by Jose Algue, published in English as The Cyclones of the Far East. And in 1899, the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Geodetic Survey published Father Algues' compilation of Philippine maps titled Atlas de Filipinas in 1899. It also contains information about typhoons in relation to general Philippine geography. Moreover, worth mentioning is Father Jose Coronas' The Climate and Weather of the Philippines, published in 1920. Although this falls beyond the scope of this paper, this work by Corona set the foundation of our present climate classification of the country. The DOST Pag-asa uses the updated modified Corona's climate map classification, as you can see in the screen. Let's look at uh, the seismologists and engineers. The period between and after two major earthquakes in the 19th century, the June 1863 and the July 1880 earthquakes, paved the way for the colonial state to assess its knowledge on earthquakes and readiness and preparedness in responding to crises caused by geologic activities. In terms of immediate response, rehabilitation, and scientific treatment of the problem, as well as the cultural valuation of earthquakes. In the address of Governor General Primo de Rivera to the people of Manila on July 1880, published in a Gaceta Extraordinaria, he asked the people to pray for God's mercy, but at the same time, encourage people to help the scientific community, okay, or help in the scientific inquiry of this fenomeno geológico. Two groups of professionals advanced the scientific research and studies about earthquakes. First were the Jesuits of the Manila Observatory, and second, the Spanish colonial engineers from the military in Ingenieros Militares, civil in Ingenieros Coloniales, and of the mines in Ingenieros de Minas. Jesuit scientists contributed to this scientific endeavor by presenting up-to-date scientific studies on the nature of terrestrial movements, giving light to some issues regarding earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The joint efforts of the military, mining, and civil engineers reconstituted the nature of their field and synergized seismology with public urban reconstruction strategies and policies. You can see in the screen right now are some of the publication or studies about earthquakes in the Philippines during the period concerned by this paper. Let's look at the work of the Jesuits. Father Faura, the first director of the observatory, can be considered one of the first professional seismologists in the Philippines. He led the development of seismic, magnetic, and astronomical sections in the observatory. The seismic section of the observatory initially started in 1869 when the observatory installed pendulum and spiral spring devices and other seismological instruments they obtained abroad. In the 1870s, the observatory successfully purchased more instruments, coinciding with Father Faura's successful network building initiatives with seismic observatories in Italy and Japan. Aside from him, his fellow Jesuits such as Father Juan Ricard, Miguel Saderamaso, Jose Coronas, and William Repetti were also active in pursuing researches in seismology in the late 19th and early 20th century. The July 1880 earthquake tested Faura's scientific theories on earthquakes. He served as the official informador of the Governor General after the incident. The civil authorities and the public received these observations very well. As an expression of the city's appreciation, the city of Manila conferred him the title Hijo Adoptivo de Manila, or adopted son of Manila. Their commendable work on the July 1880 earthquake pushed the observatory to further the research on earthquakes. They strengthened their scientific communications with their fellow scientists in Japan, Italy, and Spain. Various scientific communities abroad got impressed with their work on earthquake research. From 1880 to 1900, the observatory produced 13 scientific studies on earthquakes, published in their bulletin and in scientific journals abroad. One of those is Miguel Saderamaso's La Seismología de Filipinas, published in 1895. This is a broad attempt to historicize and provide a comprehensive understanding of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. It also describes the seismic instruments acquired by the observatory and were used in undertaking seismological studies. Seismometers, seismographs, and accessory equipment in various kinds compose the observatory's collection. Saderamaso also explained the scales used by the observatory in relation to the widely used Rossi-Forel scale and earthquake research, as you can see in the screen. So they theorized in this work. Saderamaso tried to theorize, okay, earthquakes and provided numerical and some policy recommendations for the government. The initiative to purchase instruments from Europe to help the Jesuits improve their work first came from the merchants of Manila. The observatory obtained instruments like the Bertilli thermometer, a Secchi seismograph and seismoscope, an improved pendulum from the first one installed in 1869, two geophones, a duplex pendulum seismoscope obtained from renowned scientist John Milne, pioneer seismologist of the Imperial College in Tokyo, a Secchi microseismograph, and a Gray-Milne three-component seismograph, as you can see in the screen. Let's look at the work of the engineers and the cartographers. The colonial engineers, composed of military, civil, and mining engineers, played an active role in colonial infrastructural development in the late 19th century. Andowaga considers them as the modern architects of urban spaces, and their work marked the advancement of modern anti-seismic engineering in the Philippines. These state engineers advanced seismology as a discipline and advocated its institutionalization by integrating it to programs and policies pertaining to urban edifices and building regulations. Engineers such as Gregorio Verdu, Rafael Serrero Saenz, Jose Centeno y Garcia, Manuel Cortez, Antonio Garcia del Canto, and Enrique Abella y Casariego, and the cartographer Enrique Del Monte y Muriel were the leading figures in this era. The contributions of Verdu and Cortez and Serrero on earthquakes, earthquake engineering, and anti-seismic construction methods need to be pointed out. They combined with their structural studies and calculations of resistance using mechanics, uh, and they try to estimate and try to theorize the idea of the dual influence of seismic and cyclonic forces on earthquakes in particular. Meanwhile, Abella, Garcia del Canto, and Centeno, as well as Del Monte y Moriel, contributed significantly to the scientific literature on seismology, geology, and cartography. Military from the 1860s to the 1890s, military engineers faced two sets of problems: the challenge to clamp down the remaining vestiges of the Mindanao Sultanates, and two, the responsibility of inspecting, studying, and planning and executing plans for the reconstruction of buildings and edifices destroyed by natural hazards, particularly earthquakes. Military engineers strengthened colonial fortifications in the archipelago and designed plans for the construction of earthquake and cyclone-resistant building structures. The basis of building codes in the archipelago in the second half of the 19th century lies in the quantitative construction tradition cultivated within the military culture and reflects a new and broader world of parallels between military ideas and the understanding of the natural environmental forces.
Excuse me, Kerby.
Yes.
Can you wrap up in a bit in the
Uh,
interest of time?
okay. So, uh, as I said earlier, the military there was a unified effort between the military, mining, and civil engineers in producing knowledge on earthquakes and advocating its use for public reconstruction. So I'll just browse through the presentation. These are some of the publications made by these engineers in 1858, 1862, and 1881. Verdu, Valdez, and Serrero produced Cortez, Serrero, and Valdez produced works on the nature of materials for public urban reconstruction. After the 1863 and 1881 earthquakes, Del Canto and Centeno produced
Kirby, the audio is the distorted video is
produced comprehensive studies. Is it clear now?
Yeah,
Okay,
the
okay.
audio is still distorted.
Sorry.
The your audio is still distorted.
Yeah, is it clear now? Hello.
Still, yeah,
Yeah.
it's still distorted.
Hello. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
May distortion pa rin kay Kirby, no?
Hello. Weird. because I can hear myself.
Yeah, yeah. Now it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, so okay again, Del Canto and Garcia produced studies about the 1863 and the 1880 Luzon earthquakes. Meanwhile, Enrique Casariego produced studies about the earthquakes that hampered northern Luzon uh, in the 1880s and in the 1890s. Okay, so these are published in his 1884 and 1893 publication, as you can see in the screen. I'll not discuss the content of each of the publications because we don't have enough time. Worth mentioning is the work of Enrique Del Monte y Moriel, okay, particularly his 1887 Isla de Luzon y sus adyacentes, wherein in this work, uh, were in this a product of the expedition together with Abeliak y Casariego. He published a comprehensive map of the Luzon Island, and some of the information here can be seen in the 1899 Atlas de Filipinas of Jose Algue. Just skip here. I'll just jump into the conclusion part of the paper. This study considers the work on meteorology and seismology as amino narratives, building blocks of a scientific tradition. They formed the nucleus of pioneering studies on the science of typhoons and earthquakes. From these studies, the need to plan out an immediate and sustainable public safety and urban reconstruction mechanisms emanate. The Jesuit meteorologists studied the typhoons and provided a structured scientific approach to weather forecasting. The Jesuit seismologists and colonial state engineers and cartographers applied geological and engineering principles to understand the nature of tremors and proposed plans in designing buildings and constructing urban infrastructures. Moreover, though not directly stated in the works summarized, implied in these works was the effects of natural hazards and disasters in the social structures of society, especially on how the state packages public works as mere revival of the physical component of towns more than the human and social aspects. Embarking on this, we can ask, for whom are these works for? To put it frankly, these are not for the ordinary people. These works made to circulate among the circle of experts and public officials for scientific discourse and policymaking. The elite the elite nature of these works reinforced the elite notion of science during that time. As what the metaphor of the mysterious laboratory Jose Rizal portrayed in one of the chapters of El Filibusterismo, these works were for the advancement of colonial sciences, sciences that were used for the benefit of the colonial state. Central in William Henry Scott's Cracks in the Parchment Curtain is the idea that a Filipino perspective can be seen and extracted from the Spanish historical sources. Careful and critical reading and rereading of these sources will reveal more of our history beyond what are consciously indicated in these materials. Using this approach, it is important to frame our understanding that the meteorological and seismological knowledge production that ran in the 1860s to the 1890s will not be fruitful and resonating without the valuable and indispensable work and contribution of Filipino native staff observers, native staff of these scientific institutions, from weather data collectors, instrument readers, weather observers, expedition crew, cartographers, and even draftsmen. In broad strokes, native Filipinos were, in unnoticed or undocumented ways, a vital component in the burgeoning scientific tradition of the late 19th century. Further challenge lies on the fact that we still need to highlight the role and participation of women in this scientific period. This may provide an answer to Rizal's frustration in his letter to his parents dated August 1883, wherein he lamented on how science was appreciated in Europe compared to the Philippines. Scientific knowledge is liberating. Research is a struggle to liberate oneself from a phase of ignorance to a place of enlightenment. It is liberating as well to further enrich our historical literature on the scientific development, okay, in the Philippines. Marami pong salamat and muchas gracias a todos.
Everyone. My paper is entitled Juan de Cuellar and the Production of Philippine Natural History. Um, In the second half of the 18th century, Spain launched a series of natural history expeditions in what historian Daniela Blakemar calls as the Spanish Empire's attempt to rediscover and reconquest the natural environment of its colonies. The term she used here is Botanical Reconquista. The Philippine colonial government similarly embarked on its own investigations aimed at obtaining valuable botanical information for commercial purposes. This paper examines the construction of Philippine natural history through the works of Juan de Cuellar. So, who was Juan de Cuellar? What was the context of his tenure in the Philippines that allowed him to produce Philippine natural history? Cuellar was born in a family employed in the Royal Gardens. He studied pharmacy and ran the pharmacy business of his family. In 1784, he took part and passed in the program offered by the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid, specifically training pharmacists in the scientific procedures of natural history. In 1785, Cuellar sorted and cataloged materials from the Spanish botanical expeditions in Peru and Chile. And in gratitude, this excellent cataloging work, the heads of the said expeditions named a genus of fame flower or talinum after Cuellar. In the Philippines, we're all familiar with the Real Compañía de Filipinas, which was founded in 1785. Its creation was regarded as an important step towards revitalizing the colonial economy along the reforms set by the Bourbon government. One of the company's objectives was to develop a Philippine crop which could be mass produced and traded overseas. To provide technical assistance, especially botanical expertise on the species, which could be commercially developed, the Royal Company requested for recommendations from Madrid authorities. The chief of Madrid Botanical Garden particularly endorsed Juan de Cuellar. Cuellar arrived in Manila in August of 1786 with official designation as botanist and naturalist. He headed the company's Philippine Scientific Commission. Cuellar focused largely on experimenting the commercial viability of specific species, particularly Philippine cinnamon. He sent specimens of Philippine cinnamon to Madrid to undergo various scientific tests. In Philippine historiography, Cuellar's works were often cited as one of the 18th century projects that were never materialized because of fiscal problems. This paper, however, will not dwell on the cinnamon project of Cuellar. The full-scale commercialization of cinnamon was eventually abandoned, but Cuellar remained in the colony until his death in 1801. Aside from experimenting on Philippine cinnamon, Cuellar was also tasked to study the country's natural history. His research generated an inventory of archipelago's flora and fauna and mineral resources. This paper then positions Cuellar's works within the larger project of assembling a body of natural history knowledge. I will focus on four aspects. The first one is on the contribution of Cuellar on mapping Philippine natural history. Aside from his employment with the Royal Company, Cuellar also granted the title of Royal Botanist by the King of Spain, but without compensation. As such, Cuellar was expected to report his findings to Madrid and send natural history specimens to Royal Botanic Gardens and other institutions in Spain. Upon his arrival in Manila, Cuellar immediately started collecting specimens from his travels around Manila and in the province of Laguna, where he was based. He also joined the crew of Malaspina expedition in specimens collecting in northern Luzon in 1792. He was not able to visit Visayas and Mindanao, but he corresponded with the provincial governors to send him rare and interesting natural history materials. While these materials were intended for the empire, I argue that Cuellar's activities also resulted in the mapping of the biological elements of the Philippines and helped lay the foundation for the scientific study of the Philippine natural environment. Aside from botanical materials, he also collected shells and minerals. This map, for instance, shows the mineral resources of the archipelago based on the information compiled by Cuellar. Um, Cuellar sent his first shipment of specimens to the Royal Natural History Cabinet in 1787 via the vessel sponsored by the Philippine Royal Company. He continued sending natural history specimens almost without interruption until 1797. What is interesting in these packages is that they included a long list of names of specimens sent with their origins of collection, and in many cases, Cuellar provided the local names of the species of the species. So, for instance, in one of those shipments in 1789, Cuellar listed the boxes and the boxes up to number 41 and identify the contents of these boxes. Another area in which we can see the contribution of Cuellar in laying down the foundation for Philippine natural history was to locate the position of local natures in global epistemology. For instance, he wanted to identify certain Philippine species along the contents of Horti Malabaricus. This volume, this publication, was a comprehensive catalog of India flora developed and compiled by Van Ried and published in Amsterdam in series in late 17th century. This publication was hailed as an important contribution to study Asian flora. What Cuellar did was to identify the Tagalog names of a certain flora indicated in the Hortus. He did the list for 10 volumes out of the 12 volumes of the Hortus, and he indicated the Tagalog references selected from the selected flora in the Hortus, and which were written in Latin. So, for instance, in the slide presentation, I'm showing you the what Cuellar did in the volume 1, listing down the corresponding names of certain species in Latin and providing Tagalog names in these species. Another aspect of Cuellar's contribution to Philippine natural history can be seen in his attempt to lay down the foundation for a botanic gardens in the Philippines, or an experimental station for the tropical species of the archipelago. Upon his arrival in Manila, he insisted that it will be convenient for the archipelago to create a botanical garden where to make the propagation of the most useful vegetables, fruits, and other plants that will be later on sent to Madrid. So in that way, it will also facilitate the acquisition of knowledge of the most, what he termed as the most useful and rare species of the archipelago from different parts and remote provinces of the archipelago. While the conception of the botanical garden was approved by the Royal Company, it was not executed. Nonetheless, Cuellar continued experimenting on various Philippine species in the Hacienda de Calabang in Laguna, where he was based. What is interesting here is that when he suggested for the creation of botanical gardens, he wanted this to become an experimental station for acclimatizing species and then send them to Europe. I contend that the framework of this botanical garden laid the foundation for the would-be botanical gardens which would be established in the 19th century. Okay. And lastly, I see the contribution of Cuellar in Philippine in localizing the natural history through his attempt to create a visualization of Philippine flora. For instance, let me go through the next 3 slides showing you some of the visuals, botanical slides, which he sponsored. So, for instance, there's a slide, a visual of Balimbing, of Sampaloc, of Aswete, of Alipunga, of Sigarilyas, of Cabansi. There were, I think, around 180 plates, which Cuellar commissioned during his time in the Philippines. These visuals were only discovered recently by Dr. Belen Baños Llanos in 1898, and some of these plates were sent to the Philippine National Museum, and they are, I think, displayed in our museum. We must remember, however, that these botanical illustrations were gifts for the King of Spain. In Disciple Empire, Daniela Beckmar again explores the botanical images produced during the scientific expeditions of Spain in the 18th century, and she looked at it as a reassertion of Spanish imperial capability to make global nature visible across distances. In venturing, for instance, to universalize the species, Blakemore observed that the images were drawn in plain white background that erased the possible indication of the kind of environment where they flourish. The production of the contextualized images of the species, according to Blakemore, as she argues, was not just a Spanish tradition. It represented the natural history practices of the age that attempted to incorporate global natures into European science. As newly discovered objects of nature were pulled out from various parts of the archipelago, cultural connotations were detached to give way to their baptism to Western science. So as a matter of conclusion, I want to also look at into one aspect, and I think the most important one, though I'm not sure if I can really present the role of the Filipinos in the production of the Philippine colonial natural history. Despite the aim of Cuellar's natural history activities, one of the aspects of my paper is to locate the Filipino in the epistemological production of their own natural history. I must say that task is daunting given the invisibility of the locals in the colonial sources. However, there are some cracks in which we can glimpse the so-called Filipino contribution. One was in the field itself, in the local field itself. Cuellar mentioned in his letters and reports that he was assisted by local guides during his collecting expeditions in southern Luzon. A thick forest, he mentioned, prevented him for doing the collection alone. The local guides were similarly his sources of information regarding the local names of species and their possible uses. Despite their essential role in specimens collecting, these local guides were unnamed in the documents. Another arena in which to locate the Filipino role is through botanical illustrations, which I presented a while ago. Cuellar acknowledged that it was impractical to hire Spanish artists to come to Manila to assist him in drawing the species, thus relying primarily on local talent. Upon his arrival in Manila, he searched for Tagalog illustrators for assistance. Three painters collaborated with Cuellar, Jose Loden, Tomas Nazario, and Miguel de los Reyes. Apart from their names, no other information was provided. But as a whole, we can see that Cuellar's scientific initiatives were instigated by the global epistemological trend. His Manila appointment was rendered possible by the Philippine Royal Company that sponsored his tenure in the colony. And at the end, I argued that Cuellar's natural history investigations provided the fundamentals for the subsequent tropical studies that redefine the nature and the purpose of the Philippine natural environment. Thank you very much.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the conference organizers, Michael Ponte and team, as well as Ruel for organizing this panel, and Kerby and Jely for being part of it. I'd also like to thank all of the participants for their Zoomness and zeal for sticking around and listening so carefully. So my talk today is titled Fiera del Pais and the Making of Philippine Zoologies. I've changed the title a bit there. And this presentation is based on a paper, and it's based on a couple of things. I teach a course on biodiversity and environmental history here in Singapore, and this is kind of one of the assignments that I ask students to do. But this talk is both experimental and exploratory. It's experimental because it's the first time I'm sort of thinking through this story in public, and it's exploratory because the talk hopes to chart new spaces, new intersections, new interactions for Philippine studies and for sort of future Philippine studies research. I want to suggest that there's a productive cultural history of science, knowledge, and biodiversity embedded in the taxonomic record. In surfacing this productive cultural history, I suggest a methodology based on two framing or guiding questions. What's in a name, and how is a name constituted? In many ways, my methodological approach is in communion with the field of Philippine studies, with the enduring field of Philippine studies. To the list of masses, families, cities, care providers, houses, nations, languages, and grammars, technocrats, and ilustrados, I'd like to add biological species or living archives of Philippine biodiversity. So today's talk is about the making of Philippine zoologies, or the diverse ways in which we know and understand biodiversity. Philippine biodiversity has two histories. Of course, there are many more, I mean, more than two for sure. But for the sake of Zoom, let's go with two. First and foremost, and probably most common, is the story of Philippine biodiversity as expansive, rich, and abundant. This is kind of the Wow Philippines story. And here we've got a map of Trepang diversity. As you can see from the map, there are more Trepang species in the Philippines, noted by the red, which is 75 species and more than anywhere else in the world. So this is kind of the Wow Philippines story. It's like rich, it's expansive, it's abundant. Yeah. The other, and perhaps less known, is the story of Philippine biodiversity as endemic, rare, fragile, and in crisis. This is the sort of woe Philippine story. The Tamarao, the subject of today's talk, is emblematic of this other history. For some context, there's less than 500 tamarao in the wild, according to an October 2019 report by the Philippine Biodiversity Management Bureau. Today's tamarao live within, within these protected spaces on the island of Mindoro. That's the only place that these animals are found. So we've got them living in the Mount Calivite Tamarao Reserve, which is noted by A in the map, and the Mount Iglit Bacau National Park, noted by B. So I want to historicize our knowledge of the Tamarao, not through the anthropogenic causes of its decline, but through the circuits and circumstances of its scientific name. And I get at these circuits and circumstances of scientific naming through three frames: museums, specimens, and experts. I'm only going to discuss museums today, but I'm happy to talk about the others later. Okay, before moving to then museums, I want to start with the year 1875. In 1875, the infrastructures of globalization made possible three things. A Spanish Dominican named Castro de Elera arrived in Manila. He's associated with museums, the sort of story of museums. Also in 1875, the skull and bones of a tamarao from Mindoro arrived in Philadelphia. That's the specimen side of the story. And third, a young Visayan named Mateo Francisco from Zamboanga arrived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that's the story about experts. But I'm just going to focus on museums. These three moments frame my thinking about the scientific naming and the scientific naming of the Tamarau, and the ways in which museum specimens and experts were and remain central to the making of Philippine zoologies. I use them in these various sections as sort of touchstones. So let's start with museums. Museums played a key role in the scientific naming of Philippine biodiversity. This is especially true for the University of Santo Tomas's Museum of Natural History. For a recent history of this museum, I'd suggest everybody to see Baluyut's 2019 article seen here. What I want to focus on is the idea of networks. Museums and individuals who worked at museums maintained then, as they do now, networks of trust and intimacy. This was true for Castro de Elera, the director of UST's Museum of Natural History from 1875 to 1897. Those are the years that he directed it, 1875 to 1897. These personal and professional networks of trust and intimacy resulted in collection building, scientific naming, and knowledge production. Castro was, quote, a patient compiler, end quote, as one of his Spanish contemporaries noted in writing about him. He kept lists of everything based on information he received, not from the field, but from his network. In doing so, he transformed UST's Museum of Natural History into an important node of biological reference. And we can think of this kind of node as a biological reference as a sort of Philippine biodiversity archive or library. And so these are some documents from the UST archive that sort of speak to his collecting and meticulous note-taking. Castro's most important work was his 3-volume catalog published in Manila in 1895 and 1896, seen here. And it's just worth noting, 1895, 1896, to publish something like this as the colony was going through its kind of revolution is it's a massive undertaking. So one entry highlighted here on the screen, one entry in volume 1 stands out for 3 reasons, 3 important reasons. Its brevity, its air. The Tamarau is not found in Sulawesi, as noted in the reference, and this was common knowledge and sort of received scientific understanding at the time of the publication. And also, and perhaps more importantly, what's missing, and I want to sort of dwell on what's missing. What's missing is the convention within taxonomy then, and again as it is now, to include the name of the individual credited or recognized as the first describer. That is, the one who gave the Tamarau, in this particular case, its scientific name, Bubablius mindorensis. So who taxonomized the Tamarau, and when and how did this happen? I'll start with the who first. A French Jesuit based in Zikaway, a church town on the outskirts of Shanghai in China, named Pierre-Marie Hude, is recognized as the taxonomizer of the Tamarau. It was Hude who gave the Tamarau its scientific name in 1888, a name that holds today, so it's recognized today. So about 7 years before Castro de Elera's publication, so it was widely accepted as the name. In fact, Castro uses the Latin name but doesn't acknowledge Hude. So Hude was born in 1836. He spent most of his life in China from 1867 to his death in 1902. In 1868, Hude established the Zikaway Museum of Natural History just beside the town's Catholic church. And I'm happy to share more about the life and afterlife of Hude's museum in Zikaway, but it's worth noting just a couple quick points. In 1933, the museum and its collections moved to Shanghai and became part of the Aurora University, today's Fudan University. And in 1952, it became part of the Shanghai Natural History Museum. This is a picture of the Hude Museum, as it was known, at Aurora University, taken in the 1930s. Hude amassed a rich collection of Philippine specimens, mostly mammals, from across the archipelago. Many of these specimens would become type specimens, and that means they would be the ones used to make first descriptions. So they're really, really important, these type specimens. He made several expeditions to the Philippines in the late 1880s and early 1890s. But these expeditions were more about cultivating networks of trust and intimacy than about trekking through Philippine natures with gun and trap in hand. So here are just some of the, from the kind of the specimen records. Here are some of the collection sites from which the specimens that Hude received or obtained, where they came from. We see on that list, some of the spelling's a little bit inaccurate because of the, the transformation of knowledge or the transition of information, but more or less there's a good representation of the archipelago there. But I want to zero in on this kind of network of trust and intimacy. As for the Tamrao, so kind of bouncing a little bit back to the Tamrao, it was obtained from Science de Brenda, Don Science de Brenda, the Inspector General of Montes in the Philippines Forestry Division. Hude's scientific description of the Tamrao was published in 1888 in the journal he founded in association with the Zicoe Museum of Natural History. And here's a picture of the journal, and I've highlighted the actual entry there by Hude. Moreover, Hude's descriptions were based on, or his description was based on, not a whole specimen with a skin and all. That would come slightly later, and I'm happy to talk about how that came to be. And this is the story that involves Mateo Francisco, the Filipino Visayan, but I won't cover that yet. That's in the expert section. This is museums. So that's later. In fact, Hude's description is based on a skull and some teeth. So we've got a picture of the teeth, or at least a printed picture of the teeth there, or one sort of molar there on the screen, and then the actual type specimen skull that was used for Hude's description, which is currently still in the Shanghai Natural History Museum. In some ways, this could be the end of the story. Hude received some parts of a Tamrao from Science de Brenda, who was an official in the Philippines working in the Forestry Bureau. And then Hude scripts this new endemic species, new in terms of modern science, well known, of course, on the island of Mindoro among the population of Mindoro and others. But Hude is the one recognized as scripting this endemic species, only found in the Philippines, into the annals of modern science. But if we return to the questions I posed at the beginning of this talk, to the questions that frame my thinking about the circuits and circumstances of scientific naming, and that basically, those questions being, what's in a name and how is a name constituted? I feel there's more for us to surface, there's more for us to recover if we reflect on Hude's network of trust and intimacy. I'd like to then conclude this talk with a deeper look, and a brief but deeper look, into Hude's network of trust and intimacy. At the heart of Hude's network were people, known people, important people, not so known people, basically all kinds of people. But most of these people were Filipinos. So indeed, whether he was in Zicoe in China or in the Philippines during his expeditions, Hude's network of trust and intimacy unfailingly delivered specimens He trusted the information provided in terms of where something came from, so the location, and the conditions perhaps of collection. He trusted that information, and in turn, he extended a gesture of intimacy by naming, scientifically naming, or taxonomizing a species after its collector, donor, or procurer. This practice ensured the productive and sustainable workings of his network. This list seen here on the screen provides a sampling of Hugh's network and the intimacy in which he bestowed upon it. I'm sure you'll see and recognize a number of familiar names. Let's just go through a few of them. On the top, so we've got two columns, species names. These are names that have been newly scripted into modern science. So these are names that typically stand until today. So these are names that Hugh provided. And these are all mammals. Many of them are deer or sort of deer-like animals. The first one is named after Science de Baranda, the individual who provided Hugh with the tamarau. But we find many others. Madame M. de Grico, from the sort of well-known Grico family. We've got others, Pedro P. Rojas. We've got Gonzalo Tuason, which has a nice connection to where Ateneo is today because it's the Tuason family that made a land donation or contribution. And so on and so forth. Perhaps take a little time there to kind of look at those names. So these are names of Filipinos forever, pretty much, enshrined, embodied, and embedded in these in the taxonomic record. I think I want to conclude now on this sort of point. And I want to just sort of wrap up with a couple of things. What I've tried to do perhaps through this quick talk, but what I do, I think, at a greater length in the paper. I've tried to do three things through this talk. First, I've tried to suggest that there's quite a lot we can surface or recover when we think about what's in a name and how is a name constituted. I mean, this list here alone sort of reveals all that we can uncover. Second, I've tried to show, perhaps too hastily, that there is a productive cultural history of science, knowledge, and biodiversity embedded in the often boring taxonomic record. And lastly, and perhaps more aspirationally or ambitiously, and through the story of the tamarau, I've tried to shed some light on how the circuits and circumstances of this cultural history of science, knowledge, and biodiversity, and its embodiment in museums, specimens, and experts, were central not only to the making of Philippine zoologies, but also, and more critically and more urgently, to our understandings of Philippine biodiversity today. And I want to just end with this picture, or this slide, which has on our right the newly opened or fairly newly opened National Museum of Natural History in Manila. And in the back, I kind of did a little blue light circle. You've got the tamarau right there. There's an emphasis on the early naturalists. I'd like to, I mean, in the paper, I think a lot about Mateo Francisco, the individual who provided the specimens that then were kind of the first full skin, full specimen available. Those specimens, by the way, were sent to the United States, to the University of Michigan, where Mateo spent 12 years living in Ann Arbor, as well as to the Field Museum. They were also showcased, those specimens, the ones that Mateo tracked, collected, prepared, were part of the Columbian Expo in Chicago in 1893. But we've got a specimen here at the National Museum of Natural History in Manila. These specimens serve as examples for study and for education. And I think I'll just kind of bring it right up to the present as well. When we're thinking about experts experts come in all forms, and there's all kinds of knowledge that's being, I think, cultivated and produced. And here are some of these experts that I'd like to highlight. These are current forest rangers and Tamarau rangers located in the national parks of Mindoro. It's basically them who provide so much information about the behavior and the ecology of Tamaraus, which is an enormous scientific and biological contribution. So recognizing them too as experts, much like Mateo, as well as others, I think this is the important part of what I'm trying to do. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you all for attending this panel. My presentation this afternoon is titled Addressing the Chinese Question, Rafael Comenge and the Study of the Chinese in the Late 19th Century Philippines. In this presentation, I explored the production of knowledge on the Chinese in the late 19th century Philippines by examining one particular work, the Cuestiones Filipinas, Primera Parte Los Chinos, published in 1894, and its writer Rafael Comenge, set against the background of the various transitions and transformations in the colony and within the Chinese community at that time. First, it probes the factors that motivated Comenge to write his work, which historian Edgar Wickberg described as, quote, probably the most useful general source on the Chinese in the 19th century Philippines, unquote. Why and how did Comenge write it? And why at that particular period of time? What materials did he use and how did he use them? What was his stance on the Chinese question? And why was this his position? Second, it examines the book itself. How was the Chinese question defined, presented, and problematized in the book? And how were the Chinese portrayed? How was such portrayal instrumental in advancing the author's agenda? What solutions did the book offer to the government to address such complex issues? In order to provide some answers to these questions, it is important to situate them within the broader economic, social, and political milieus of the 1880s and 1890s. It is important to emphasize that the late 19th century was a challenging period for the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines. For instance, during that time, the Philippines was experiencing economic depression, particularly in the 1880s, when the price of sugar, our main export commodity, was declining. So there was also the currency crisis in the 1880s, which had to do with the question on whether the Philippines should adopt a monometallic or bimetallic currency standard. That is, should the Philippines continue to use silver or gold, or should we shift to gold, or should we use both silver and gold as the standards of our currency? Benito Legarda Jr. also claims that the 1880s can also be considered as a decade of death because of the high mortality rate during that time, due to the outbreak of diseases, particularly beriberi and cholera epidemic. In the 1880s, for instance, 1882 and 1883, 1888 again, there were cholera epidemics. There were also numerous typhoons during this time, as well as earthquakes. One of the most destructive earthquakes in the Philippines occurred in 1880. Okay? And also there was this increasing social discontent, particularly in the countryside, as evident in the rise of tulisanismo or banditry in the countryside. There was also this challenge to the colonial government, particularly posed by the reform movement, both in the Philippines, and in Europe. So the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines had to confront these various issues, but at the same time, they also had to address the Chinese question, which is basically what should the Spanish colonial government do to govern, to administer the Chinese in the Philippines, particularly during this time when the Chinese had a very dominant role in the colonial economy as merchants, artisans, and laborers. Also during this time, there was a considerable increase in the Chinese population in the Philippines. For instance, on the matrix, on the table rather, you can see that in 1881 up to 1890, the population of the Chinese in the Philippines almost reached 45,000. Okay? This number does not include those who were illegally came to the Philippines via Cagayan in northern Luzon and through Sulu in southern Philippines. Okay? There was also the issue of Chinese migration to in residence in the provinces. So, meaning to say, during this time, the Chinese were no longer concentrated in Manila, Iloilo, and Cebu, the three commercial centers of the Philippines during that time. But they started to migrate in various parts of the archipelago. There was also the issue of increasing criminality among the Chinese, particularly from the lower class, from the laboring classes. The social outcasts, they were called social outcasts. Those vagrants, Chinese vagrants, beggars, unemployed, pickpockets, those Chinese were basically insolvent, indigent, too poor to be able to pay their taxes, for instance. Okay, and also there were issues on public health and sanitation, particularly in Manila, where Chinese laborers would live in squalid and congested apartments called accesorias or posesiones, which for the Spanish colonial authorities were breeding ground of diseases and to a certain extent of immorality, because there was also this issue of Chinese engaging in sodomy, because most of them or all of them were male laborers living in small, unhealthy dwellings. So the colonial government had to address these various issues. While colonial government was thinking of how to remedy these concerns, in the Philippines there was also the emergence of this anti-Chinese campaign during that time. These were actually non-violent agitations led by certain politicians, businessmen, and journalists, but most especially by anti-Chinese journalists. The target of this anti-Chinese campaign were the Chinese merchants and police. This condition reached the Qing government in China, so the Chinese government had to send a mission, the Wang Yu mission, to the Philippines in 1886. Actually, the mission was not only sent to the Philippines, but in other parts of Southeast Asia. The main goal of the mission was to check the conditions of the Chinese in the various areas of Southeast Asia. And in 1886, the Wang Yu mission reported to the Qing government that among the Southeast Asian countries in the mission visited, the conditions of the Chinese in the Philippines were most appalling. I included that passage to highlight that although the anti-Chinese campaign during this time was not violent, it was seriously taken not only in the Philippines but also in China. Okay? This anti-Chinese campaign was spearheaded through various media like pamphlets, newspapers, and books. During that time, all newspapers except El Comercio had had an anti-Chinese position. Okay? For instance, on the screen you can see the newspaper Manililia published issue issued the issue was on January 5, 1889. So it shows here the transformation of a Chinese coolie. So uh, uh, when the Chinese coolie, when the Chinese arrived in the Philippines, he was a cheap laborer, but after 2 years, he would be transformed into a rich merchant. So that's the stereotype, the view of the, 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 the newspaper. Okay? So because of the economic opportunities available for the Chinese in the Philippines, the transformation could happen within 2 years. Of course, that's not true, but that's how they tried to depict the transformation of the Chinese in the colony. Not only pamphlets and newspapers, there were also various books published during that time. There were at least 5 major works on the Chinese published in the 1880s and 1890s. Okay? So the first was Los Chinos and Filipinas. This was actually a collection of articles published in the La Oceania Española, which were later on compiled and edited by Del Pan. Okay? There were also other works like La Inmigración China en Filipinas, also by La Oceania Española, La Inmigración China en Filipinas by Ramon Jordana y Morera. There's also one in 1892, La Inmigración China y Japonesa en Filipinas, which tries to compare the benefits and disadvantages of Chinese immigration and Japanese immigration into the Philippines. And the last publication during that time, last major publication during that time was published in 1894, The Cuestiones Filipinas, Primera Parte Los Chinos, written by Rafael Comenge, which is the focus of our discussion. Rafael Comenge y Dalmau was born in Valencia. He studied law at the University of Valencia and also philosophy and letters at the Universidad Central de Madrid. He was a lawyer. He was a writer and playwright. He wrote a number of plays, a number of literary works when he was still in Spain before he came to the Philippines, and even after his short stay in the Philippines, he continued to write plays and other literary pieces. He was also a journalist. He wrote for the newspapers in Valencia and Madrid. He was active contributor in the El Progreso, a newspaper in Madrid in 1891, prior to his coming to the Philippines in 1892. Lastly, he was also a politician. He was member of the Liberal Party of Spain. This is very interesting. We need to take note of this fact, because it was his being a member of the Liberal Party that he was sent to the Philippines and was able to research on and write about the Chinese in the Philippines. So his connection with the Liberal Party started when he was still an intern at the law firm of lawyer and politician Sigismundo Moret, okay, for 3 years, 1879 to 1882. Moret and Praxides Mateo Sagasta were heads or leaders of the Liberal Party in Spain, which was established in 1875. When Sagasta became the Prime Minister of Spain in 1892, he appointed Segismundo Moret to become the Minister of Development and then later on a Minister of State. It was Moret actually who convinced Sagasta to send Comenge to the Philippines in order to work with the liberal government in the Philippines during that time. The goal, of course, was for Comenge to know the conditions of the Philippines and come up with recommendations on how to properly and efficiently govern the Philippines. So Comenge arrived in the Philippines in 1892 and he stayed here until the latter part of 1894. 1895, he was pulled out from the Philippines because he had to be part of the Spanish embassy in Paris. Okay? In the Philippines, in that short period of 2 years, he served as the fiscal at the Tribunal Contencioso and the legal advisor to the Spanish colonial government. So, Comenge was the writer of the Cuestiones Filipinas, Primera Parte, Los Chinos. So, when Comenge arrived in the Philippines, his goal was actually to write a series of books on Philippine questions, Cuestiones Filipinas. Okay? But for him, the most urgent of all the issues at that time was related to the Chinese. Hence, the first part of the first book of the series had to do with the Chinese. Hence, the primera parte of the Cuestiones Filipinas dealt with the Chinese. The book was published in Manila by Chofre y Compañía in 1894. Interestingly, in that very short period of time, Comenge was able to write a 470-page work, okay, compared to other major works on the Chinese in the Philippines during that time that only had like less than 200 or less than 250 pages. Comenge was able to write a very thick volume on the Chinese. The Cuestiones Filipinas had an advertencia. It has 7 main chapters, appendices, which contain the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese calendar, and the Chinese religious calendar for 1893, and an index. It is important to note that the chapters in the Cuestiones Filipinas do not only focus on the Chinese in the Philippines, but it also some of the chapters also examines China and its people. For instance, in chapter 1, you can see there's an in-depth analysis on China, its history and its people, its culture. Okay? The chapter 2 focuses on China-Philippines relations before the 19th century. The third chapter focuses on Chinese immigration and the formation of the Chinese community in the Philippines, including all the socio-economic institutions existing in the Chinese community. The fourth chapter focuses on intermarriages and the emergence of the mestizo class. The fifth talks about the Chinese in agriculture, or the problem of encouraging the Chinese in the Philippines to venture into agricultural pursuits. The sixth chapter focuses on Chinese religions, basically Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and how these Chinese religions were combined or syncretized with the Catholicism, the Catholic faith in the Philippines. The seventh and last chapter focuses on the Chinese as a source of state income. So in the last chapter, Comenge discusses how the government should impose stricter tax collection from the Chinese, how to impose the cedula de capitación personales, and all other pecuniary contributions that could be extracted from the Chinese. So it is also important to note that this Cuestiones Filipinas were just one of the many works of Comenge on politics and governance. His first work, published in 1888, was about gambling in Spain. Right? And until 1834, when he was an active politician in Spain, he continued to write political works or works on politics and governance. What are some of the aims or the major aims of the Cuestiones Filipinas?
Hi, Jely. Excuse me. Sorry. I would just like to request if you could wrap up so that we have time for questions.
Okay. So the aims, as I have said, is to create policies to be imposed upon the Chinese, and also to provide to serve as a guide to the day-to-day interactions with the Chinese. The readers, of course, the intended readers were policymakers in Madrid, colonial officials in the Philippines, and also the general public. Okay? The methods and sources used: published works by officials, travelers, missionaries in Spain and in the Philippines and in China, as well as works on the Chinese by Del Pan, for instance, and Ordana y Morera. He also used official records and interviews. Okay. What are some of the salient points? We can discuss this in detail later. Of course, as I've said, Cuestiones Filipinas had an anti-Chinese stance. Comenge believes that the Philippines had to be protected from the Invasión Amarilla, or the yellow invasion. But aside from being an anti-Chinese, the Cuestiones Filipinas tries to present a holistic view of the Chinese question. It tries to examine all angles of the issue. And even before the term transnational became popular, we can say that the Cuestiones Filipinas had already offered or used the transnational perspective in examining the Chinese question in the Philippines. There's always, in examining the Chinese in the Philippines, we should always include the China dimension. These are some of the major recommendations of Comenge on the Chinese question: restrict immigration, impose heavier taxes, regulate activities, incentivize agricultural pursuits, regulate vices like gambling and opium use, encourage intermarriages, because the offspring of the Chinese father and Filipina mother would become loyal to the Spanish colonial state and to the Catholic Church. And also, he recommended the church to undertake intensive religious conversion among the Chinese. In conclusion, the last 2 decades of the Spanish regime in the Philippines was a challenging period for the colonial government. Various political, economic, and social problems in the 1880s and 1890s had greatly challenged the state bureaucracy. One urgent concern was the Chinese question, and in order to craft relevant policies to confront this issue, the government had to depend on available about the Chinese. It was within this context that Rafael Comenge was sent to the Philippines. In a brief span of time, which was less than 2 years, he was able to collect data, write and publish his Cuestiones Filipinas intended to be used for policy making and as a guide for the general public's daily interactions with the Chinese in the colony. It is important to note that the relevance of the knowledge produced by Comenge through his Cuestiones Filipinas was not confined within his period. In February 2019, exactly 125 years after it was first published, Wentworth Press, an Australian company, republished the Cuestiones Filipinas. At the back cover of the 2019 edition, it reads, quote, "This work has been selected by scholars as being culturally important and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it." This description, for me, is one testament to Comenge's contribution and the work's unquestionable and enduring significance in understanding the Chinese in Philippine life. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Jely, and thank you to all our presenters. Now, the floor is open to questions from the members of the audience. Although we already have 2 questions in our chat box, I would like to prioritize questions coming from the members of the audience here in this meeting. Do we have anyone? Okay, if none, then let me go straight to the questions. We have 2 questions here in our chat box. The first one is, thank you, Dr. Alvarez, for your interesting presentation. My question is about the development of the fields of meteorology and seismology. May I ask if there were courses on meteorology and seismology that were introduced in the Philippines, or were these disciplines still incorporated or already separated from physics? Salamat. It's from Nicolo Ludovice. And then from Grace Concepcion, question for Ruel. I'm not sure if he mentioned it at the end. Were the artists credited for their illustrations in Cuellar's works? Any clue about who they were? It's very interesting to note the meeting of art and science and the production of scientific knowledge. So, and then for Jely, so that we have all these questions answered one after the other. For Jely, what was the reason for incentivizing agricultural pursuit, and how was that supposed to control Chinese activity? Also from Grace Concepcion. So we begin with Kerby, and then with Ruel, and we end with Jely. Yes, Kerby, go ahead. Hi, Kerby. We can't hear you. Kerby? Seems to be a problem with the microphone because you're not on mute, but we cannot hear you.
Oh, it's clear now?
Yeah, that. Okay.
So to answer Nico's question, based on the documents I have, the first subject that is specifically named meteorology or seismology was the one that was offered in the 1920s at the University of the Philippines. It's titled Meteorology 11, and the teacher that facilitated the course was Miguel Selga. He was hired as a lecturer by the university and taught at the university for almost 2 years. Now, I suppose most of the subjects on meteorology and seismology during the late 19th and early 20th century are included on the subjects such as physics and geography. So I think that's my answer to your question. But as a separate subject, it only appeared in the 1920s, particularly in 1925. Thank you.
Yes, Ruel.
Nakamute si Sir Ruel.
Thank you, Grace, for your question. I think at the end of my presentation, I did mention the names of the collaborators, illustrators who helped Cuellar in botanical plates. There were Jose Loden, Tomas Nazario, and Miguel de los Reyes. Unfortunately, I only got the names and no other information was attached or included, including regarding the three illustrators in this project. Okay.
Jely,
Yeah.
about the question?
Thank you so much, Ma'am Grace, for that question. For the Spanish colonial government, it was a challenge to encourage the Chinese to go into agriculture. So one of the recommendation of Comenge was to incentivize agriculture, especially there will be tax deductions when the Chinese would go into agriculture. Uh, the other question would be if the Chinese would go to agriculture, how would the colonial government control the Chinese? I think the idea was that the Spanish colonial government had to control Chinese immigration. The Comenge, for instance, did not advocate for total banning of Chinese immigration, uh, but not encourage, but regulate the coming of the Chinese, and those who would come to the Philippines had to be encouraged to go into agriculture.
Thank you, Jely. And then we have a few more questions in our chat box. This one from Dr. Lou De Leon Bolinao. Question for Kerby, Ruel, and Anthony. Maybe we can have Anthony answering this question first. The Filipinos were apparently secondary players and assistants in the field of science in the late 19th century. How critical were the contributions of indigenous knowledge in these fields, and were they incorporated in the scientific knowledge produced by the Spanish nationals? Then next one from Philip Vergel Ayad to Professor Alvarez. Were Indios and other colonial subjects allowed to work at the institution of the Jesuits? Were any of them graduates of Escuela Nautica? And then there's another one from Dr. Francis Navarro. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is for Dr. Galang. On the issue of criminality among the Chinese, although there were courts that dealt with the problems among the Chinese, what means were applied by the colonial government to curb this problem? Thank you. Anthony, yes, please begin.
Yeah, great. I see the button there. Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I guess what I was, the final slide that I had of that long list of scientific names with the procurer, the provider of specimen and information, for me, that's an enormous contribution. So I would actually say Filipinos actually were critical to scientific knowledge production in the 19th century, and especially the 20th century, but particularly in the 19th century when things are sort of newly being described in modern science. And just an example is if we look at Regino Garcia, who was a botanist, a Filipino botanist who worked with the forestry division. He was the illustrator of Blanco's Floras de Filipinas. He was an instructor at UST. He had a long career with the Forestry Service. I mean, he collected a number of specimens or species, sent them to Hude, the Frenchman in China, and Hude would write up these descriptions, both kind of physiological, anatomical descriptions. That's for species identification, but he would incorporate all kinds of information that would accompany those specimens when a Filipino or when somebody in the Philippines would send them. So something about the ecology, something about the habitat, something about the behavior, the color, the reproductive life, the life history of the specimen. So I guess in short, there was an enormous role that Filipinos played in this production of scientific knowledge. It's enshrined in many ways in those scientific names. And I think if anything, that's what I'm trying to hopefully point out is a kind of corrective. You know, we shouldn't think that Filipinos weren't part of that process, but in fact, they were central to that knowledge production, and that the legacy of that work and the labor is embodied in the scientific name. For instance, Reginio Garcia has a species named after him by Hewed. Thank you.
Can we have Kerby next? You may weigh in on Dr. Bolinao's comment, and then can you please answer Philip's question regarding colonial subjects at the institution of the Jesuits?
Okay, so to answer first, Dr. Bolino's question, the natives were
Kirby,
hello.
your audio is distorted.
Yeah, I can start the video as well. Hello.
Yes, it's still distorted, Kirby.
Hello.
Yes, Kirby.
Okay, yes. It's okay now?
Can you speak again?
Hello.
Yes, there's still some level of distortion in your audio.
Okay, so hello.
Yeah,
Hear me now?
that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so to answer Dr. Bolinao's question, the natives, for example, in the case of the observatory, the Jesuits needed the support and needed the natives in identifying some particular atmospheric phenomenon or phenomena based on the data they collected. For example, in one part of the cyclones in the Far East, there's a discussion by Algue wherein he indicated that he was not really familiar with the different kinds of winds. Okay, that the natives know because it was vital for them to understand the nature of the typhoons. It is important for them to understand the different kinds of winds, the direction of winds in the Philippines or in the Philippine archipelago. So they needed the natives for them to understand how the workings on the ground. What were the workings on the ground? So I think that's one important aspect. Second, in several expeditions that the Jesuits undertook, they needed the natives because the natives were familiar with some geographic frontiers. For example, in Mindanao, so they needed the natives for them to have a smoother journey in different parts of the archipelago, particularly in the frontier areas. In the case of the engineers, I'm yet to see clear examples of how natives participated in the work. Okay, but I really hope I can find documents that will reveal their participation in that particular endeavor. And to answer Philip Ayad's question, were natives allowed to be part of the institutions of the Jesuits? From 1865 until the 1880s, during the time that the Manila Observatory was still a private institution, uh, uh, the native personnel of the observatory were very minimal. Okay, so most of them are for routinely tasks inside the observatory building. But come 1884, when the observatory was transformed into a state meteorological agency, the Jesuits were quote unquote forced to hire more people for them to pursue their mandate of of doing weather forecast not only in the area of Manila, but rather in the whole island of Luzon, later on in the whole Philippines. So they hired more people, and were there graduates from the Escuela Nautica? I haven't encountered an account or a document pertaining to that.
Thank you, Kerby. And Jely, before you answer Dr. Navarro's question, because there are some related questions to Dr. Navarro's earlier question. This one from Teresita Angsi. How much power were the Kapitan Chinos given to administer the affairs of the Chinese community then? And another from June Galang. Uh, are there narratives in Comenge on how the established Chinese mestizos look at the new Chinese immigrants of the 19th century? I hope you can answer all three questions in one go.
Hello. I cannot start my video. Okay. Okay, thank you, Sir Chas, Ma'am Tessie, and Sir June for your questions. Sir Chas, you're right. You're correct that there was a special court for trying Chinese criminals during the 19th century. This was the Tribunal de Sanglies in Binondo. I think one important development during that time, especially in relation to policing and surveillance of the Chinese, was the Spanish colonial government's closer coordination with the leaders of the Chinese community. For example, the government had to rely on the help of the Gobernadorcillo de Sanglies. That's one. Second is the Gremio de Sanglies in Binondo, and the Tenientes de Chinos and Tenientes Mayores de Chinos in different parts of the Philippines. So I think this development is unique in the latter part of the 19th century, because even if, for instance, the Spanish colonial government already had police agencies, law enforcers, for instance, for them it was also necessary that the Chinese community itself should be encouraged to be part of the policing and controlling of the Chinese in the colony. With regard to Ma'am Tessie's question, the power given to Kapitan Chinos, I'm assuming the Kapitan Chinos, Ma'am Tessie is referring to the Cabecillas or because in the 19th century, the head of the Chinese community, at least the political head of the Chinese community in Manila, was the Gobernadorcillo de Sanglies. Under him were the Cabecillas, or the political and economic leaders of the Chinese community. What powers did the government give these officials? The Gobernadorcillo de Sanglias, for instance, had administrative functions. Judicial function, the Gobernadorcillo de Sanglias, for instance, was the presider during the trials at the Tribunal de Sanglias. He was expected, for instance, to help the government in the collection of taxes from the Chinese. Okay? The Cabecillas would also help in the Gobernadorcillo de Sanglias functions. In the provinces, the Tenientes de Chinos and the Tenientes Mayores de Chinos would seek help from the Gobernadorcillo de Sanglias in Manila in issues related to the Chinese in the respective areas. I hope that answers Ma'am Tessie's question. For Sir June's questions, yes, there are some passages in Comenge's work that deal with the Chinese mestizos of the 19th century. Now the question is, how did the Chinese mestizos view the new Chinese immigrants during that time? It depends on the economic interests of the mestizos. For instance, if one particular Chinese mestizo was into, for instance, into one particular trade, and then the new Chinese immigrants would be detrimental to his trade, to his business, his position would always be to ban or to regulate the coming of these Chinese immigrants. However, there were also some Chinese mestizos, Chinese mestizos who were amenable to allow the new Chinese immigrants to come to the Philippines. For instance, the Tuasons, this was mentioned by Anthony a while ago. The Tuasons, for instance, had this company, the Aldecoa y Compañía. Okay? They had the abaca plantations in Samar, Leyte, and Surigao in the 1880s. So for the Aldecoa y Compañía of the Tuasons, the most efficient laborers that should be employed were the Chinese laborers. So they were amenable to encouraging Chinese immigration to the Philippines in the 1880s and 1890s. So it depends basically on the economic interest of the Chinese mestizos. And you can read this, the general view of the Chinese mestizos on Chinese immigration in Comenge's work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jely. And I think we have the last two questions, both questions coming from our Facebook live stream. The first one comes from Bec Alfora. Hello, Dr. Pagunsan. Great presentation. Were Cuellar's studies utilized by the colonial government when it eventually ventured in cash crop economy by the 19th century? I just want to know if scientific production also sponsored the transition from mercantilist to export economy. And then for our last question for this panel from Bettina Barrera, I'm guessing this one is directed to Kerby. Where was the funding for the Manila Observatory and other related establishments during that period coming from? So let's begin with Ruel.
Thank you for the question. I think there was no direct link with regards to the influence, the connection of Cuellar to the growth of 19th century cash crop economy. However, as I want to focus on the other contributions of Cuellar in Philippine natural history, and trying to look into how he laid down the foundation for the other aspects, aspects of Philippine natural history, such as the botanical gardens and the scientification of and the naming and documentation of the Philippine flora and fauna. He was when he arrived in the archipelago, he really wanted to classify Philippine elements based on the modern way of naming them. So I think these were some of the connections or linkages that we can see on how Cuellar's works influenced the later development of Philippine botany and even or Philippine natural history in general. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Okay, so to answer Bettina's question, the funding came from two sources. First, most of the funding of the Jesuits of the Manila Observatory and the engineers of the various inspecciones came from the government. Most of them government funded or government commissioned special projects. Second, in the case of the observatory was a great, received a lot of financial donations, newspaper subscriptions were in the part of the subscriptions were given to them, and not only from the merchants of Manila, but also from neighboring countries such as from the merchants of Hong Kong, bankers from Hong Kong. So they received a lot of donations, and through those donations, they were able to purchase a lot of instruments from Europe. Some instruments were specifically designed and invented by their fellow Jesuits in Spain and in Italy. So government and private funding.
Okay, I guess that should be the wrap up for our panel. Thank you very much to our presenters, Ruel, Anthony, Jely, and Kerby. Thank you to all our participants, the members of the audience. Very, very active session, including the audience in our Facebook live stream as well. And we end session 8 here. We still have one more session left for the conference. Please be with us when we begin session 9 at 2:45 p.m. So thank you very much and have a good day.